All right, so thank you. It's a huge privilege to be back here, and especially on this occasion. The last time I addressed this society, I attacked Hegel and defended bad infinity, and Bob chaired my session. And it was really the first time I really started to get to know Bob. I mean, I knew him. He was editing EJP and I was editing Inquiry at that time. And we had edited each other's work and we had corresponded. But we also had, deeper in the background, we had been in the same place at the same time with the same teacher. So we were both taught by Edward Craig at Cambridge in the 80s. But we didn't actually know each other then. He was a graduate student and I was an undergraduate. But Edward was the one person I knew on the faculty at Cambridge who was interested in Hegel, and so clearly that stuck with both Bob and me. But the meeting here in Teddy Hall was definitely the beginning of an incredibly rich relationship that lasted a really long time, but not long enough. We discovered straight away we had a lot of kind of quirky common interests. Ought without can, for example, and Luther, among other things. We taught for a month in China together, during which we had 40 formal meals with a senior member of the Chinese Communist Party. Which was a super interesting and important part of my education, and seeing Bob engaged on those occasions was just extraordinary. And then, yeah, I mean, we really both started working, we're both working on the will, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I think I won't go further reminiscing, because I might not be able to escape from reminiscing. So I guess this is a kind of a doubly cheeky talk. First of all, I'm going to repeat things that some of you have already heard. You know, I used to be a fox, but at the moment I've become a hedgehog. I'm only interested in one thing, and I'm just really trying to get it right. And so I end up talking about that over and over again, so I apologize for the repetition. But blame Holgate, or Stephen, because he invited me to reprise what I said in Sheffield. But I am going to talk about Hegel. That's my text. I'll give you a minute to read it. I hope I spelled it right. It's really hard. Maybe I'll read it aloud. I have to say, with all the wealth in Oxford, the shortage of really good whiteboard markers, the will is particularity reflected into itself, thereby restored to universality. It is individuality, the self-determination of the I, in that it posits itself as the negative of itself, that is, as determinate and limited, and at the same time remains bei sich, that is, in its identity with itself and universality, and then there's another clause even after that.
And that's paragraph 7, right?
Paragraph 7, philosophy of right, okay? So I hope I've earned my keep now. I brought some Hegel into the room. I have to tell you, I do not understand that sentence. So my talk is, please explain that sentence, and now we'll go to discussion. But before we go to the discussion, I want to tell you about the work that I am doing, a few things that I think I do understand, and then I want to, at the end, come to at least propose a schema for interrogating that sentence. I still don't know how to apply the schema, but I'm hoping we can do that together. Okay, that's my plan, the doubly cheeky talk. So my title today, Brian already alluded to it, Recognitive Volitional Practices and the Ontology of the Will. And I'm going to start off by talking about recognitive volitional practices. So let me first try to say what I mean by that. What's a recognitive volitional practice? So sort of, that's what it says on the tin. It's a practice in which someone is recognized as having a will in a matter. Yeah? So you can all think of examples. A consent ritual at a hospital intake is a recognitive volitional practice. In taking the consent of the patient to be cut up with a scalpel, there's a practice there, the participants are engaging in it, and the patient is being recognized as having a will in this particular matter. Okay, so that's what I mean by a recognitive volitional practice. Good. And the sort of strategy that I've been adopting, I'm on leave at the moment, and I'm trying to finish this book. The book is called Reinventing the Will. And my strategy in that book is to try to study the will by studying recognitive volitional practices. So there's kind of an ethnographic or anthropological dimension to it, and I've been not doing field work myself yet, but working with people who do field work. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I want to do that in a way that's also really tied into the incredibly distinguished long history of philosophers thinking about the concept of the will, right? So I want to tie those two things up together. Philosophers have this amazing set of theories of the will going back thousands of years, and then there are the actual practices in which that concept is embedded. My strategy is to try to study those two things together. So why would you want to reinvent the will? Well, maybe you don't want to. You might think the concept of the will that we've got now is just great. The concept of the will that gets applied in consent procedures and so on is just fine. It's hard won through a lot of philosophy and theology and law, and so it's perfectly fit for purpose. But you should at least be aware that the concept of the will and the recognitive volitional practices that we have going now are exclusionary. So there are people who are locked out of being recognized as having a will. There's a very ancient principle in law. The Latin phrase is furiosi voluntas nulla est. In the law dictionaries it says, the madman has no will. That's actually not a proper translation. It really should be something like, the will of the madman is nulla, is nothing. So if you're a furiosi or a furioso, somebody who's dangerously and furiously mad, you're not recognized as having a will. And so you are locked out of all the forms of legal agency and legal recognition that you need to have a will in order to play the game. Yeah? So it's exclusionary in that way. Now again, you might think that's fine, that's perfectly right and proper. Maybe that we're right. Maybe we should have a pretty exclusive notion of the will. Maybe we only want to admit some people into this domain of full legal agency, full legal capacity. And so we should be right to have a sort of stringent threshold at the gate. But you should also know that there is a global movement, very intensive at the moment, trying to comply with international law, which says we need more inclusive regimes of legal capacity. We need more inclusive recognition of people's legal agency. And for that, you're going to have to go back and deal with that I call it the Justinian maxim, because it was written down in the Justinian Code, although it was much older than that. You with me? Does that make sense? I'm kind of what is the thing Hume says about philosophy is the handmaiden of, I'm the handmaiden for this movement. I'm not going to tell them which concept of the will or which volitional practices they should adopt, but I want to explain a kind of menu of options that philosophers have come up with over millennia of work on the will, so that they can think about what would be the best one that would be fit for purpose for this agenda. The name I give to that global movement is the struggle for recognition of the will, the struggle for will recognition. And that is a very, very real thing every day on psychiatric wards and in care homes and in courtrooms. People struggle to be recognized as having a will. The international law says you ought to respect a person's will, but you can't respect it unless you can at least attribute a person as having something to be respected. Okay, so that's the struggle for will recognition. All right, so that's all pretty abstract. So I now want to spend some time telling stories. I've got 3 stories for this talk. Some of you will have heard 2 of them before, and the third will probably be familiar to everyone. So the first story is just terrible, terrible, terrible. It's an atrocity. Some of you have heard me talk about it before, so trigger warning. It happened in Japan in 2016 at a big institution, a care facility for people with severe cognitive disabilities. It had 160 beds. On this particular April night, 150 of them were filled. This was a kind of institution that's been closed down in a lot of other jurisdictions, but not in Japan. The person who'd lived there the longest had lived there for 51 years. So this is long-term, in a very remote, beautiful location, but completely separated out from full integration with the rest of society. And in the wee hours of the morning, a former member of staff broke in through a window, armed with a bunch of knives, and he went around killing people. He stabbed 43 people, and he killed 19 of them. Now, the thing about this terrible story, it's the largest single mass casualty event in post-war Japan. And it was also on the anniversary of the signing into law of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a kind of a high holy day on the disability rights calendar. He did not, though, stab everybody. He had a method. He went around from room to room, and at each room, he called out, it's 3 in the morning, he called out to the people within, and if they responded vocally, that is to say, with language, then he passed on to the next room. But if they didn't respond vocally in the sense, then he stabbed them. And in papers that subsequently came to light in the inquiry, he says that he was trying to eliminate the people who had no will. After this atrocity, there's a task force. I'm actually going in November to talk to some of the people who were involved with that, to investigate this. One of the things that was discussed over a series of meetings of the task force is what to do with this facility. Some people wanted to close it down. Some people wanted to turn it into a memorial. Some people wanted to keep it open. And at one point in the proceedings of this task force, you can read in the notes, somebody says, well, maybe we should find out what the will and preferences of the residents are. That's a phrase from international law. International law says you should respect the will and preference of disabled people. So maybe we should consult them, find out what their will and preference is. And the family members, some of the family members said, our children have no will. So the same idea, the same thought, both in the mouth of the perpetrator of this atrocity and in the mouth of the loved ones. So you can see the exclusionary character of the onion. So there's my first terrible story. Second story, less terrible, lots less terrible. Happy story. It's in Al-Aziyah, which is a town of about 50,000 people in Upper Egypt. It's a community that is entirely Christian. It's they're Arabic-speaking Coptic Christians. It's a very ancient Christian community. You can read about it in Acts of the Apostles. The particular thing that's happening in Al-Aziyah on this day is a baptism. And actually, I want to talk about baptism today. I got two baptisms I want to talk about, but start with this one in Al-Aziyah. So baptism, sacrament, obviously, a very central part of Christian practice. It's also the site of a lot of controversy in Christianity, intense fights about the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it and who it should be done to and so on. A very, very contentious topic. Some Christian sects perform adult baptism, some Christian sects perform infant baptism. In Al-Aziyah, people talk about three forms of baptism. They talk about baptism by water, that's christening. They talk about baptism by the will, that's adult baptism. And they talk about baptism by blood, which is martyrdom. And very controversially, some of them practice rebaptism. They do both child baptism and adult baptism. So there's some I've been working with the most amazing ethnographers, anthropologists who are studying this community. It's just fascinating literature. But the key thing for this, what's happening in this story. It's an adult baptism, and there's a recognitive volitional practice. At the culmination of the ritual, the priest says, "Will you be baptized?" Actually, first he says, "Do you renounce the devil?" And the candidate turns from west to east. Yeah, they physically turn around, renouncing the devil. I don't know which way is west and which way is east here. And then, "Will you be baptized?" To which the response is, "I will." Okay? So recognitive volitional practice, the priest is discerning and attesting to the will of the baptismal candidate to be baptized. Okay? All right. Those are the first two stories. I got one more for you, but you have to work for that first. All right. First bit of work. I expect this is familiar, I apologize, but I just want to make sure we have it and we have it in the same way. I want to start with the concept-conception distinction. Theory of justice, first 10 pages. People know that. We have a concept of justice, Rawls says. We all have that. Everybody sees that justice is a virtue of societies in virtue of which there's a fair distribution of goods and benefits and opportunities. Yeah? That's what it is for a society to be just. Everybody thinks it's a virtue of societies to be just. What they differ in is their conception of justice, right? Well, what's the right way in which the goods should be distributed? And Rawls wants to defend a particular conception of justice, right? So that's the concept-conception distinction. It's important to note, I think it's actually quite tricky to get it exactly right, and I'm not going to try to do that here. Rough and ready is good enough. It is important to say, as well as the different conceptions of justice, that's what the book is really engaged with, there are different concepts of justice as well. Rawls talks there in those first 10 pages about Aristotle's concept of justice in the Ethics, where he's talking about Holgate is a just man, right? It's a virtue of character, of an individual, of a person. That's a different concept of justice. They might be related in some complicated way, but we can just disambiguate here by saying that's one. And then there's distributive justice. That's what he's mainly concerned with in the book. There's also procedural justice. Again, they might be related in interesting and important ways, but we can distinguish different concepts of judgment, concepts of justice. And then, so the response to different concepts of justice is to disambiguate. Let's be clear, we don't want to talk at cross purposes. We all want to be on the same page. And then the real work of philosophy is articulating and then choosing among the different conceptions. Okay? With me? So I want to use that same distinction now for the will. And let's start with concepts. There definitely are different concepts of will. Actually, the word will, especially in English, is just unbelievably ambiguous. So for one thing, we talk about a person's last will and testament, right? We call that their will. Most languages have a different word for that. In Latin, it would be testamentum. I think, as far as I know, English is the one language that uses the same word there. So anyway, that's one concept of a will. There's also, we talk about a certain young child is very willful. There's another concept of the will that's at work there. But the concept of the will that I'm interested in, let's call it voluntas, okay, as opposed to testamentum. And it's the one that is at the heart of the exercise of modern legal agency. It's at the core of being recognized as a player before the law. It's what you do, what you exercise when you consent, when you refuse, when you sign a contract. A contract itself is the coincidence of two wills in this sense, in a certain kind of context, yeah? When you make a gift, these are all in modern law, and by modern I mean modern as opposed to really ancient. These are all exercises of the will in the sense of voluntas, okay? So that's the concept of the will that I'm interested in. It's what you exercise or manifest when you buy something, for example. But then we also, zeroing in on that, we have an amazing number of different conceptions of the will, of what that voluntas is. And this is something Bob and I talked about a lot in China, but also particularly at that Luther event in Aarhus on whatever it was, the I guess it was 500th anniversary of the 95 Theses. We were talking about Luther's conception of the will and what his conception of it was. So I've been tracking conceptions of voluntas. And both Bob and I adopted an approach in this, it's basically an Aristotelian approach. You want to know what something is? Ask what it does when it gets to work, right? What's its work? So what does the will do when the will is working? What's the work of the will? So you can track different kind of conceptions of the will by different answers to that question. Now, in Luther, what the will does when it's at work is it wants stuff. The will desires. Bob in particular loved the sentence, I think it's from the exchange with Erasmus. He says, the will is a beast. And it's either ridden by God or it's ridden by the devil. Yeah. So that's a kind of a Luther's conception of it. It's not choosing, right? It's definitely not choosing. But there's another tradition where the work of the will is choosing. And for this, the patron saint would certainly be Augustine, right? Liberum arbitrium. So arbitration, choice. I prefer the word election or selection, where there are a bunch of things that are on the table, there are a bunch of things I want, and then the work of the will is selecting among them. Notice on this conception, if the will were just one more want, it couldn't do its work, right? The point is you need this thing that takes wants as inputs and then takes plans or intentions as outputs. So it's very, very different kind of work for the will. So those are two different ways of thinking, two different conceptions of the will. So a big part of what I've been working on really since that meeting in Aarhus is what I call taxonomy. I think we philosophers, we live in this kind of jungle of volitional theory. There are so many theories of volition that have grown up over millennia. That's amazing. And so let's go in there and first of all, just like figure out what we've got. And so I've been adopting this kind of Linnaean taxonomic approach to that, distinguishing genus and species, but also at a higher level, just major orders. And we just found two of the major orders. One is willing is wanting, and another is willing is choosing. Both of those very well represented. Now, I got in trouble with Tom Pink, but I'm willing to go toe-to-toe. I think that Hobbes also belongs to that same order with Luther. I think Hobbes thinks that willing is a certain kind of desiring. Not all desiring is willing for Hobbes, but it's the appetite that actually moves you to action. That's the will. It's the one, all those different kind of appetites and desires jockeying for position in your soul, and the one that like pulls the lever on muscular motion, that's the one we call nominalism, the will. So I think Hobbes belongs to that same taxonomic order with Luther. Not the same species, I concede that to Tom. There are important differences, but the same order. Harry Frankfurt also belongs to that order. It's really interesting. There's a footnote in the Freedom of the Will and the Concept of the Person where he says, I don't have anything to say about choice here. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a theory of the will and of its freedom. You don't even need to talk about choice for Frankfurt. And it's basically a Hobbesian position. His definition of the will is it's the desire that leads to action. So that's quite a distinguished cohort. But then we go back to the other order. Oh, wait a second. One more member of that desire order is Aquinas. It's sort of surprising, but does anybody know Aquinas' definition of the will? Rational appetite. Yeah? So it's an appetite. Not all appetites are the will, it's the rational one. And then he has like a five-fold analysis, of course he does, of the elements of that rationality. Just one of which is means-ends rationality. Other things are, the desire for the universal, the desire for the particular in the universal. It's a really interesting analysis, actually. So Thomas is also, I think, in that order. There are people who are outside those two orders. You know what I'm going to ask you eventually, right? What is that? What is that thing in the volitional jungle? How do we taxonomize that? But don't start on that yet. Schopenhauer would be, I think, a different order. I'm not sure. Maybe he's a candidate for a different order. The will can take the form of desire, but it doesn't have to. That's a particularly like psychological form of the will already. The will itself, well, if O'Shaughnessy is right, for the Schopenhauerian will is just trying. It's striving, it's urging, it's pushing on. That's so maybe that's a different taxonomic order. Well, Kant. What is the will? The will is practical reason. Is that a different? I think that's a different order. I think that's a different order. I'm not sure. I leave that for another occasion. In Japan, where I've been doing a lot of work, the word for the will, I think word is not quite the right word here. It's a semantic unit, and the sign for the will is pronounced ishi. It's really a Chinese character, and it is made up of two characters combined together, one on top of the other, one of which is the character for heart, and the other is the character for voice. Now, I'm not sure that ishi stands alone much, but it figures, for example, as a component of the word for consent. It has that in it. So one way of thinking of the will is through that character, it's giving voice to the heart. Okay, we can keep going. But one more needs to be mentioned. And that's what Michael Freda thinks was the first real theory of the will, is the Stoic theory. And for the Stoics, what is the will? It is assent. It's volo or nolo. Yeah? I agree, I don't agree. That is the work of the will for the Stoics, is that thumbs up or thumbs down. So it's a response to a proposal, a plan, a care plan, a proposal about where I'm going to be placed. It's either yes, I will, or no, I won't. And volo there is the root for voluntas. So that's another, well, anyway, we could quarrel about how to do the taxonomy, but that's, I think, an interesting and important discrete conception of the will. Anyway, what you can see, I'm building up a menu of options, and they're quite, I think, diverse. And so the question would be really, which of these conceptions do we want, in particular in this ongoing struggle for the recognition of the will. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm sure I'm taking up way too much time. So that's the part, recognitive volitional practices, yeah? I've introduced that term, and my vision is you really need to think about concepts of the will in a way that's integrated. I guess it's Wittgensteinian. I hate to admit it. I never wanted to be a Wittgensteinian. But maybe it's Hegelian. Think about the concept in the way in which it is locked in to certain ways of doing things, certain kinds of practices. I want now to go on to some of the work that Stephen asked me to do, which is about the ontology of the will. Because I brought this up in Sheffield, and it was clear that Stephen thought we did not get to the bottom of that. And so I think that's why I was invited back here, so that I could really try this out on you, and you could correct me in the errors of my ways. So I've been exploring a hypothesis, okay? Can I just emphasize, I'm putting it that way. I'm not advancing this thesis. I've been exploring this hypothesis. And the hypothesis is about the ontology of the will, that is to say, the mode of being of the will. And my hypothesis is that the will has a recognitive ontology, ontology. So let's talk for a few minutes about that. And I'm really looking for help on all of this, but here at the Hegel Society, obviously, this above all. So I've been distinguishing three different sort of candidate modes of being, three different candidates for the ontology of the will. I think the dominant position in the tradition is that the mode of being of the will is psychological. The will is something mental. And when the will breaks on the scene in the 2nd century or so AD, you'll know, I'm sure, there is no concept of the will in Plato or Aristotle, right? No concept of right either. Those two things might be related. When the will breaks onto the scene in the second century, it breaks on the scene as, oh my God, there's another fundamental faculty of the tsuke, right? Who knew, right? We knew about nous, we knew about thumos, but lo and behold, there's another one. And that's the will. So it's explicitly coming along as with the mode of being of mind. It's also, the process that Bruno Snell controversially called the discovery of the mind and the discovery of the will are very much tied up together. But anyway, that's maybe a story for another day. So anyway, that's the dominant, and the dominant position you find in the jungle treats the mode of being of the will as mental or psychological. There's another tradition which treats the mode of being of the will as social. So we talk about the general will of the people, the will of the community, right? So there, we're not talking about something psychological. No doubt it has some kind of relationship to psychological, but anyway, we're talking about a social mode of being. There, I don't know if this is right. I'm tempted to say that's a different concept of the will than the one I'm talking about. But I don't know if that's the right move. But anyway, that's a second candidate. But then, Hegelian synthesis, right? The third candidate would be put the first two together. The mode of being of the will is psychosocial. To have a will implicates certain psychological facts, but by themselves doesn't make it a will. It somehow has to be embedded in the right kind of social setting in order for it to amount to a will. So that would be a third candidate ontology, not narrowly psychological, not social, but psychosocial. And then as a subset of the psychosocial, I want the recognitive. There's a special case of psychosocial entities, beings which have the mode of being psychosocial, where their being in some way depends upon recognition. There's a tempting slogan here, a variation on SAS percipii. Yeah, I don't know, somebody's Latin would be better than mine. To be is to be recognized. And there definitely are some things that are like that. My example is a ballot, right? So if I take a piece of paper and I write on it Kamala Harris, born in the same hospital, by the way, you can touch me later. If I write Kamala Harris on a piece of paper and then I put it in a special box on my living room table, I can write ballot box on it. That is not a ballot, right? That is not a ballot. Why? Because it's not a recognized ballot in a recognized election in which I am a recognized elector, right? So the mode of being of ballots is recognitive. I can't help, it so happens, or at least there are a lot of sources that say the original word for the will in Greek that the Stoics gets translated as volo and all that is sun katathesis. How about that? And what is sun katathesis? Voting. Voting. And there was no voting until somebody invented democracy, right? Nothing could be a ballot, until somebody invented democracy. Until you had, anyway, so voting in ancient Greece, you put a token in a urn, sun katathesis. I put it in together. Okay, so that would be an example I propose for something that has a recognitive mode of being, a ballot. Its being consists in being recognized. That's the first approximation, and we've got to work some more to refine it. Other things, ambassadors, I think, have a recognitive mode of being. Embassies, diplomatic pouches, these are all things in the world of international diplomacy where you have to be recognized. Just to have a message to deliver does not an ambassador make. Just putting, your messages in a special bag doesn't make it a diplomatic pouch. It has to be recognized as that. Okay, so there we go. Now I think maybe you can understand my hypothesis, which is that the mode of being, the ontology of the will, is recognitive. I have managed to convince no one of this so far, including maybe myself. I don't know, but I want to keep pressing. I want to keep pressing on with it. Did I mention that Bob's last seminar was on the will at Yale? I think 2022. I have the reading list for it. I also have for it the kind of blurb in which he poses the question that he wants the whole seminar to address. You can well imagine what question that is, because it's the same question he wants to ask God, which he's no doubt now asked God, much to his surprise, about voluntarism and intellectualism. It's an amazing reading list. In Sheffield, he told me he had materials that he would be happy to share with me. I gather Joe has the slides from that seminar, and I think we should think as a society about, is there something we could do with that material? Because, well, I for one want to know what's in it. What was Bob's last word on the will? I mean, you know, we really want to know. And so if anybody else wants to work on that, somebody must have been there. They better have taken good notes or we're going to kill them. But anyway, I propose that as an initiative, and if anybody else has materials for that, please, please let me know. I'm almost up to another story. I might be ready for another story. Yes, I'm ready for another story. Okay, so here we go. Final story. My last story is fiction. It's a fictional baptism. And it's from film, from cinema. Actually, there are a lot of really good baptism scenes in cinema. One of my favorite, I think there ought to be a special category at the Academy Awards, like Best Baptism. Best supporting role in a baptism. Best editing of a baptism scene. I like the Coen brothers, Brother, Where Art Thou? Has people seen that? Fantastic baptism scene. That's my second favorite. But the Lifetime Achievement Award for baptism scenes has to be Francis Ford Coppola, 1972, the culminating scene of The Godfather. Now, if you haven't seen The Godfather, you should not be in the Hegel Society of Great Britain because it's actually part of the entry requirements. You've never seen The Godfather? Well, you should leave now because I'm going to spoil it for you.
I'm not going to say it.
It's a very, very famous scene. It's also a tremendously groundbreaking scene, especially in terms of editing. It's a form of editing we've kind of gotten used to now, but it was explosive at the time. So it's not the last scene, but it's the culminating scene, and it's a baptism scene. It's in a large American Catholic church. Those of you who've been in America, you immediately recognizable, very different from a European Catholic church. It's mostly empty. The family is there in the corner. It's pre-Vatican II, so it's all in Latin. And Al Pacino is there. And the Godfather's character, his sister, has the firstborn from the next generation. And this christening is unfolding. Baptism is unfolding. And it's pre-Vatican II, so there's lots and lots of Latin. Actually, one of the things I want to do is I want to know the Latin. I want to hear that Latin. But as all this Latin is going on and on and on, it's then so Mike, the Al Pacino character is becoming a godfather, right? He's literally the godfather to this infant, but he is also becoming, in the same time, the godfather in the usual way by taking out the key rivals for that position. And so through all that Latin, it's intercut between the church, and you see the three assassins all like making their way in the cleverest and most intricate possible ways to make these surprise hits on the rivals. You go through more Latin, another guy on his way, and then you come to the culminating moment, and the priest switches from Latin into English, and he says, "Do you renounce the devil?" And Al Pacino says, "I do renounce him." And then it cuts to another scene, and you see he's very much not renouncing the devil. And then he says, "Do you renounce all his works?" And he says, "I do renounce them." And he cuts to another. And "Do you renounce all his pomps?" I'm not sure what a pomp is exactly. And "I do renounce them." And then he says, "Will you be baptized?" And Al Pacino says, "I will." But I skipped one important thing. What he says is, "Michael Rizzi, will you be baptized?" But Al Pacino is Michael Corleone. Michael Rizzi is the baby, played, by the way, by Francis Ford Coppola's daughter, now a filmmaker in her own right. And in fact, all of those questions are directed to Michael Rizzi, the baby. Michael Rizzi, do you renounce the devil? Al Pacino says, I. It's a very deviant use of the first person pronoun. It's a violation of all the rules of indexicality. It's just wrong, actually, if you apply our dominant understanding. He doesn't say, I on behalf of I consent for Michael Rizzi. No, he says, I will, okay? So that's a recognitive volitional practice. Michael Rizzi, the infant, is being recognized as having a will in a matter. Michael Rizzi has no understanding of what baptism is or what the devil is, and yet he is recognized as having that will. So right at the heart of our tradition, and in fact, at the centerpiece of the greatest film scene in American film, is a recognitive volitional practice. Most of us just miss it, but it is very distinctive. If you were a Hegelian, you might be tempted to say it's the I that is we and the we that is I. To me, for me, it's a huge resource. First of all, rhetorically, it's a resource because people who would never countenance the thought that somebody could have a will in a matter they don't understand, they nonetheless know that scene. It's also at exactly the right kind of distance in our tradition. There's a Heideggerian strategy here of trying to recover practices that are lost, but they're not completely vanished, in order to help us see that actually the way we're doing things is just one way of doing things, and there were other ways of doing things. There's a different way of conducting recognitive volitional practices. And so the project of the book is to give a theory of that. And again, I'm not advocating for it, but you can, I hope, see the way that it might have an application in this project of inclusion. Because in that tradition, they are managing to include within recognitive volitional practices. I mean, you wouldn't say that Michael Rizzi has a disability, but he's very minimally abled, which is probably a better way of talking about disabled people anyway, variously abled. This is somebody who has very, very few abilities. And actually, what's going on in Michael Rizzi's head? What is the psychology of that? Probably, I think actually the baby is asleep. There's actually nothing going on. There's no psychological component. Here's a British Hegelian thought. It's all in the relations. It's all in the right kinds of relations. Okay, I should stop soon because I want to know everything that you have to say about that. But there are two more little pieces of work before I can. Do I have time for two more quick pieces of work? So again, these are both debts to Stephen. Stephen, on our way to the bar, to the train station or whatever, in Sheffield, it was just an impossibly sad moment. You know, that event in Sheffield was so fantastic. It was a milieu. It was so shared and everything completely alive. And then I don't know if you had this, as soon as you walked away and you were on your own, it was like, oh my God, it was terrible. But just before that moment, Stephen made it clear you asked me, as I recall, to be more precise about the recognitive ontology idea so that we could assess it. And this is the perfect place for doing that. And you also asked me by email to elaborate a bit on how I saw this as relating to what Hegel has to say about the will. So I'm not going to be able to do all of that now, but let me try at least to make a down payment, and we can follow up. So let's do it in the form of objections. Even if you're tempted by my hypothesis, remember the hypothesis that the will has a recognitive ontology, you probably have objections. Everybody has objections. You ought to have objections and concerns. And one objection is, look, at least sometimes people can have a will that goes unrecognized, right? And so if to be was to be recognized, that would just be impossible. That could never happen. So I might just have a secret will or one that nobody's ever taken the trouble to recognize. Now, there's a lot to say about this, and some of it's quite intricate. And I've been working in the last few days of writing on trying to do that intricate work in a way that is maximally accessible to my very broad audience that I'm hoping for in this work. And I'm happy to go through that, but I'm not going to go through that detail now. For present purposes, let me just give a short and technical reply, okay? So this is a very dense little bit, but I'm just trying to state what I think is the bottom line. So the recognitive hypothesis is not that every will or every act of willing must be recognized, or that nothing can be a will without actually being recognized. That's not the thesis. And that's why SAS Recognandi or whatever is the wrong slogan or a dangerous slogan. What is the hypothesis? So, two elements of it. First, the hypothesis first is that the will exhibits what I'm calling a mereological ontology. So there's a long exposition of what I mean by that, but the short version of that is, let me just read it so I get it right. It's one of those things that can only be what it is by reference to a larger whole of which it is a part. So lots of things have mereological ontologies. They can only be that thing in virtue of playing a role in a larger part. So that's what I mean by a mereological ontology. And the hypothesis second is that the larger whole to which the will essentially makes reference itself essentially includes norm-governed recognitive volitional practices. And specifically, it includes practices for distinguishing what is and what is not a will. Okay? So, sorry, that's super, super dense, and I'm happy to try to explain it later. An example I've been using, I'm working right now with somebody who works in the philosophy of sailing. It's really interesting. Who knew? But think about the example of a bowsprit, right? So a bowsprit has mereological ontology. Bowsprit's that bit at the front of a traditional sailing ship, and it holds the foresail further out. It basically extends the boat. It's a piece of, traditionally, it's a big single piece of oak, at least in the British tradition, and it sits there. So in one sense, a bowsprit is just a piece of wood, but its being as a bowsprit is mereological. It can only be a bowsprit in virtue of its place at the bows of a ship, of a certain kind of ship, in fact. And I think also, really, it can only be a bowsprit in virtue of a larger whole in which the practices of sailing play a role. But now if you go to Greenwich and you go to the Royal Maritime Museum, you will see on the wall a bowsprit, and the sign says Bowsprit of Defiance. It is a bowsprit. It's not actually part of any ship anymore, but it essentially makes reference to that kind of whole. So that's what I'm saying about the recognitive ontology of the will. Any particular act of willing may or may not be recognized, but its mode of being as a will makes essential reference to a recognitive whole. Okay, then the last piece of work is basically to make sense of this, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you to do that, but I wanted to propose a kind of schema, and I think I might have forgotten to write this down, but basically you'll see it's just fallen out of the work we've done. What does this sentence mean? But I want to answer that in a particularly structured way. So whatever that means, that's what the will is for Hegel. So what, for Hegel, does the will do when the will gets to work? What is the work of the will? Second question, what recognitive volitional practices does this theory of the will project or integrate with, presuppose? And thirdly, what's the mode of being of this, the will understood in this way? And specifically, does it have a recognitive ontology? Stop.